The seating chart was taped to the wall outside the ballroom on a piece of foam board with the venue's logo printed across the top. Guests were finding their names and their table numbers with the cheerful confusion that always surrounds these moments at weddings, people leaning in, running fingers down the alphabetical columns, laughing when they found themselves next to someone they knew. I stood in front of that board in my dress shirt and the tie my daughter had told me was perfect when I had shown it to her 3 weeks earlier, and I found my name. Walter Okafor, table 11. I stood there for a moment reading it. Table 11 was against the far wall of the ballroom, a round table for 8 set back from the dance floor near the service entrance, the kind of placement that venues reserve for guests who are present but not central. Guests. I had written the check for this ballroom 4 months earlier. I had written the check for the catering and the flowers and the photography and the rehearsal dinner and the honeymoon deposit. I had written a total of $58,000 in checks over the course of 14 months to make this evening exist, and my name was on a card at table 11. I straightened my tie. I found my table. I sat down. I smiled at the strangers around me, and I began, quietly and without any outward indication of what I was doing, to make a series of decisions that would take 14 months to fully execute, and that would surprise everyone who thought they knew what kind of man I was. I am that kind of man. They simply had not been paying attention. My name is Walter Okafor. I am 64 years old. I was born in Lagos, Nigeria, came to the United States at 19 on an academic scholarship to study electrical engineering, and built a life here over 4 decades that I am proud of in the specific way that a person is proud of something they constructed from nothing in a place where no one was obligated to help them, and most people were simply indifferent. I earned my engineering degree, then a master's, then spent 32 years with a utility infrastructure company, the last 14 as a regional director overseeing capital projects across 4 states. I became a citizen in 1989. I bought my first house in 1993. I married my wife Gloria in 1991, a woman from Accra who had come to the United States for graduate school in public health, and who had the combination of intelligence and warmth and absolute moral clarity that I have spent my entire life trying to deserve. Gloria and I raised 2 children in our house in Maryland. A son named Kwame, who is now 36 and lives in Houston and works in petroleum engineering. A daughter named Adiz who goes by Ada, who is now 33 and who was, until 14 months ago, the child I believed understood me best. I mention that specifically because understanding is not the same as appreciation, and I had confused the two for longer than I should have. Gloria passed in 2020 from pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the morning, I sat beside her bed and held her hand and felt the specific quality of stillness that enters a room when a person leaves it. She was 61 years old. She had spent her career in public health administration, had managed federal grant programs for maternal health initiatives, had testified before a congressional subcommittee twice in her career, and had done all of it while also being the kind of mother and wife and friend that people describe at funerals in ways that make you realize most eulogies are written for ordinary people, and occasionally, rarely, you hear one that is written for someone who was genuinely exceptional. Her eulogy was that kind. The house we had lived in for 21 years in Bethesda was hers in every important sense. Her taste was on every wall, her garden was along the south fence, her books were on the shelves in the study. After she died, I stayed in that house because leaving it would have meant leaving the last physical location where she still existed in the details, and I was not ready for that and told myself I might never be ready and made my peace with that position. The house was paid off. My pension and my investment portfolio were solid. I was, by any practical measure, a man in a secure position with no financial anxieties and no one to answer to. That security, I would come to understand, was something Ada and her fiancé Marcus had noticed and assessed and incorporated into their plans long before they shared those plans with me. Ada had been with Marcus Reinhold for 4 years before they got engaged. Marcus was 36, worked as a software architect at a tech firm in Washington, came from a family in Connecticut that had money in the particular old way that means it has been there long enough that no one in the family remembers exactly where it started. His parents, Gerald and Patricia Reinhold, lived in a large house in Greenwich and drove European cars and had the kind of surface polish that comes from generations of being in rooms where surface polish is considered a basic requirement. Gerald Reinhold had retired from investment banking. Patricia Reinhold organized charity events and served on boards and maintained a social calendar that Gloria would have found exhausting, and that I found, from the limited exposure I had to it, to be a full-time occupation dressed up as volunteerism. When Ada brought Marcus home for the first time, I was pleasant and attentive and asked him the questions a father asks a man who is dating his daughter. He was articulate and confident and clearly intelligent. I did not dislike him. I was uncertain about him in a way I could not fully articulate at the time, and that I have subsequently been able to articulate in considerable detail. What I sensed, without being able to name it, was that Marcus assessed rooms and people and situations the way his father had assessed financial instruments. He was looking for value and positioning and opportunity, and dressing the assessment in the language of interest and warmth. I was one of the rooms he was assessing. I was aware of this without knowing how to act on it, so I watched. Marcus proposed to Ada in October of the year after Gloria died. He called me the evening before to ask for my blessing, which I appreciated as a gesture and gave genuinely, because Ada's happiness mattered to me above every other consideration, and because a blessing is not the same as an endorsement, and I knew the difference. The engagement party was held at the Reinhold home in Greenwich 3 weeks after the proposal. It was a large and carefully organized event attended by people I did not know, in rooms that had been designed to communicate a particular kind of success. I was introduced to Gerald and Patricia Reinhold for the first time that evening. Gerald shook my hand with the confidence of a man who had shaken a great many hands and had developed opinions about what hands told you. Patricia kissed the air near my cheek and said it was wonderful to finally meet Ada's father, and used a tone that suggested the finally contained a gentle critique I was meant to absorb without acknowledging. I smiled and said the evening was beautiful and meant it, and moved through the party with the ease of a man who had spent 32 years navigating rooms full of people who had made preliminary assessments of him, and who had learned that the most effective response to a preliminary assessment is to let the other person believe it is accurate until the moment it serves you for them to discover it is not. I had a glass of wine. I talked to Ada's friends. I drove home at 10:30 and sat in Gloria's study for an hour thinking about what the next year was going to look like. The conversation happened 6 weeks after the engagement, in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon when Ada had come over alone without Marcus, which I noted as a deliberate choice that she had made, and which told me the conversation had been planned, and the planning had included a decision about staging. She sat at the kitchen table where she had sat for 30 years, and she talked about the wedding they were envisioning. She described the venue, a historic estate in Virginia wine country that she had visited twice and loved. She described the guest list, 220 people. She described the photographer they wanted, a well-known wedding photographer whose work Ada had followed for years and whose pricing reflected the well-known part of that description. She described the catering, the flowers, the band, the rehearsal dinner, the honeymoon. She described all of it with the detail of a person who had been thinking about it for longer than 6 weeks and who had arrived at this conversation with a number already arrived at. Then she told me the number. She said she and Marcus had hoped that I might be able to contribute toward the wedding costs, and that they were estimating total expenses at somewhere between $80,000 and $90,000, and that the Reinhold family had indicated they could contribute $30,000, and that they were hoping I might match that. I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table. I asked her one question. I said, "Ada, what does Marcus think about the conversation you and I are having right now?" She said he thought it was a good idea for the two of them to express what they were hoping for and allow me to make my own decision. I said that is a very careful answer. She did not respond to that. I told her I would think about it and let her know. She left an hour later. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after she left. Then I called my financial advisor and asked him for a current accounting of my liquid assets. Not because I was deciding whether to contribute, because I was deciding how to structure what I was about to do so that it served my daughter's actual interests and not a set of expectations that I had not agreed to and that had been presented to me as if agreement were a formality. I want to be clear about something before I describe what I did. I was not opposed to contributing to my daughter's wedding. Gloria and I had always intended to help with Ada's wedding the way we had always intended to help with both children's significant life events. Quaim had received a contribution toward his house down payment 3 years earlier. Ada had received financial help with graduate school. Helping was not the issue. The issue was the structure of what was being asked and the assumptions embedded in the structure. $30,000 from the Reinhold family, who had multiples of my net worth and for whom $30,000 was a gesture rather than a contribution. A matching request from me which was not matching in any proportional sense given the difference in our financial positions. A venue and a scale and a guest list that had been chosen before my participation had been confirmed. And a framing that presented all of this as an expression of hope that I was free to respond to as I chose, which was technically accurate and practically a form of pressure that relied on my love for my daughter to do the work that a direct request might have made too explicit. I sat with all of that. Then I decided to do what I had decided to do, which was to contribute generously and completely and on terms that I established and documented, and that protected both my daughter and my own position in the events that followed. I called Ada 3 days after our kitchen conversation. I told her I was prepared to contribute $58,000 toward the wedding. I heard her breath change on the other end of the phone. I told her that the contribution would be structured as a documented gift with a clear accounting of what each amount covered, and that I would handle the vendor payments directly from my accounts rather than transferring funds for her or Marcus to manage. I told her I had one condition. She asked what it was. I said I wanted to be included in the wedding planning in a manner appropriate to a parent who was funding the majority of the event. She said, of course. She sounded genuinely moved. I told her I loved her and that I wanted her wedding to be everything she had imagined. I meant both of those things completely. Over the 14 months between that phone call and the wedding, I paid for everything I had agreed to pay for, and I documented every payment with the precision of a man who had spent 32 years managing capital projects, and who understood that documentation is not distrust, it is respect for the complexity of what you are building. The venue deposit, $4,500 paid in month 1, receipt retained. The catering contract, $18,000 across 3 installments, each documented. The photography, $6,500 paid in full upon contract signing as the photographer required. The flowers, $4,200 paid 30 days before the event. The rehearsal dinner at a restaurant Ada had chosen, $7,800 paid 2 weeks before. The honeymoon deposit, $5,000 paid at Ada's request when the travel agent required confirmation. The miscellaneous costs that accumulate around a wedding of this scale, dress alterations, transportation, additional decoration, attendant gifts, came to the remaining balance. $58,040 in total, documented to the cent, all paid directly to vendors in my name. Throughout this 14 months, I was present for venue walkthroughs and catering tastings and florist meetings when invited and available for phone calls about decisions when asked. I was not asked as often as I had been told I would be asked. The planning had a center of gravity that was not me and was not Gerald and Patricia Reinhold. The center of gravity was Patricia Reinhold, who organized things, who had opinions about things, who called vendors directly on matters I had been told were being handled collaboratively, and who had, I came to understand, a vision for her son's wedding that the $58,000 I was providing was funding without my vision being a relevant input into the outcome. The rehearsal dinner was held the evening before the wedding at the restaurant Ada had chosen, a beautiful place in Alexandria with a private dining room that held 40 people comfortably. I had paid for it. Gerald Reinhold stood at the head of the table and gave a toast. It was a warm and articulate toast that mentioned Marcus's childhood, his professional achievements, his evident love for Ada, and the Reinhold family's joy at welcoming Ada into their family. It mentioned Gloria, which I appreciated, and described her as a remarkable woman, which she was. It did not mention me. It did not acknowledge that the dinner being eaten and the wine being poured and the room being occupied had been arranged and paid for by Ada's father. Gerald Reinhold thanked the restaurant and thanked the guests and thanked his son and thanked Ada and raised his glass, and everyone raised their glasses and I raised mine. Afterward, Patricia Reinhold came to me at the far end of the table and said it had been a lovely evening and what a beautiful room, as if I had been a fellow guest rather than the person who had written the check for the room. I said the evening had been wonderful. I smiled. I had a glass of water after the wine because I wanted to be completely clear-headed for what I was observing and filing away. The wedding was on a Saturday in June. The venue was exactly as Ada had described it 14 months earlier, beautiful and thoughtfully arranged and full of flowers that cost $4,200 and photographs that would cost $6,500 to produce and food that had been selected at a tasting I had attended and paid for. I arrived at the venue an hour before the ceremony and stood in the entry hall watching the final preparations with the quiet satisfaction of a person who had made something possible and who did not need to be thanked for it in that moment because the thing itself was its own acknowledgement. Then I found the seating chart. Table 11. I have already told you what Table 11 was. I will add only that Table 11 was positioned so that the father of the bride, from his seat against the wall near the service entrance, would have a partial view of the dance floor and a direct view of the kitchen door through which servers moved in and out during the meal. I found my seat. I introduced myself to the people around me, an older couple who were colleagues of Marcus's parents, a friend of Ada's from college who had not made the wedding party, a distant relative of the Reinhold family who had traveled from Ohio. I ate the food I had paid for. I watched my daughter dance her first dance with her husband in the dress I had helped pay for in a room I had paid to rent. I did not make a scene. I did not pull anyone aside. I did not leave early. I stayed for the entire evening, danced once with Ada when she came to my table, kissed her cheek, told her she was beautiful, and drove home at 11:30. The drive home was 40 minutes. I drove it in silence without the radio because I wanted to think clearly, and I think most clearly in quiet. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made 3 decisions. The first was that I was not going to have an emotional conversation with Ada about the seating chart or the rehearsal dinner toast or the 14 months of planning that had treated my involvement as financial rather than familial. Those conversations produce heat without light, and I had never found them useful. The second decision was that I was going to consult my attorney, a man named Howard Park who had handled my estate planning since 2015 and who I trusted completely, about updating several elements of my estate documents that had been written with certain assumptions about family relationships that the preceding 14 months had revised. The third decision was about the house, Gloria's house. The house we had paid off in 2011, and that was worth, at current market, somewhere between $800,000 and $850,000 depending on the comparables. The house I had been maintaining alone for 4 years because I was not ready to leave it. I had been not ready for 4 years. Sitting in my driveway at 11:30 on the night of my daughter's wedding, I decided I was ready. I called Howard Park the following Monday morning. Howard Park had been my attorney for 9 years and had the quality of a person who processes information without reacting to it, which is the quality you most want in an attorney handling your personal affairs. I sat across from him on that Monday and I told him about the wedding and the seating chart and the rehearsal dinner and the 14 months and the $58,000. He listened without expression. When I finished, he said, "What would you like to do?" I told him I wanted to review my will and my beneficiary designations and my estate structure with fresh eyes and revise anything that no longer reflected my actual intentions given my current understanding of my family relationships. He said, "That is entirely appropriate. Let's go through it." We spent 3 hours that Monday going through every element. The will, which had distributed my estate equally between Ada and Quame with specific provisions about the house. The beneficiary designations on my investment accounts and my pension. The trust structure that Gloria and I had established in 2017 to manage the house and certain assets. By the end of 3 hours, Howard and I had a clear picture of what I wanted to change and why and what the changes would accomplish. He needed 2 weeks to prepare the revised documents. I told him to take 3 and do it right. I also told him about the house and that I was thinking about selling it. He said that was a significant decision and asked if I had thought it through. I told him I had been thinking about it for 40 minutes on a drive home from a wedding and that I would give it another 30 days before I committed to anything. 30 days later, I told him to list it. I spent 6 weeks preparing the house for sale, which was also 6 weeks of going through 21 years of a life together and making decisions about what to keep and what to release and what belonged to me and what belonged to the house and what the difference was. Gloria's garden I photographed in detail and saved the photographs in an album I had made at a print shop, because some things you do not keep the physical version of, but you do not let go of entirely either. Her books I kept entirely, except for the professional texts that I donated to a university library where they would be used. Her kitchen I left exactly as she had designed it, because the couple who came to see the house on the 3rd day of showings walked into that kitchen, and the woman put her hand on the counter and looked at her husband, and I knew the house had found its next family. It sold for $830,000. I moved into a 2-bedroom condominium in a building 12 minutes from Howard's office with a balcony that faced west and got the kind of evening light that I had not had in any place I had lived since my apartment in graduate school. I furnished it slowly and with attention. I bought one piece at a time over 4 months. Each piece was chosen because I wanted it, not because it matched something else or filled a space or suited a vision someone else had for how the place should look. It was, for the first time in my adult life, entirely and only my home. The revised estate documents that Howard prepared reflected several changes from the previous version. The house, of course, was gone from the estate because I had sold it, and its proceeds had been added to my investment portfolio and restructured accordingly. The equal distribution between Ada and Quame was revised to reflect what Howard and I agreed was a more accurate accounting of our actual relationships and my actual intentions. Quame, who had called me every Sunday for 12 years without fail, who had flown home when Gloria was diagnosed and again when she died and again on the first anniversary of her death, simply to sit with me for a weekend, who had never asked me for anything beyond the relationship itself and who had sent me a card on my birthday every year since he was old enough to address an envelope, received a substantially larger share of the estate than the previous version had assigned him. Ada's share was not eliminated. She was my daughter and I was her father, and those facts did not change because of a seating chart. But the share was adjusted to reflect the $58,000 that had already been transferred in her direction, and to reflect my honest assessment of what our relationship actually was rather than what I had wished it to be. A charitable remainder trust in Gloria's name was established to direct a meaningful portion of the estate toward the maternal health initiatives she had spent her career advancing. Howard reviewed the final documents with me line by line. I signed them on a Tuesday afternoon in September, 15 months after the wedding. I drove home with the condominium keys in my pocket and made dinner and ate it on the balcony in the evening light, and felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was the specific satisfaction of a person whose affairs are in order and whose life reflects what they actually believe. Ada called me 4 months after the wedding on a Sunday afternoon. It was the most substantive call we had had since the kitchen conversation 14 months earlier, and it had a quality that I recognized as genuine because Ada had, underneath everything, her mother's inability to sustain a performance for very long when the performance required her to be something other than herself. She said she had been thinking about the wedding and about how it had gone and about certain things she wished had been different. I asked her which things. She mentioned the seating chart. She said she had not known about it until after the fact, that the seating arrangements had been handled by Patricia Reinhold and Ada's coordinator, and that she had not reviewed the final chart before it was posted. She said when she found out she had been upset and had said so to Marcus and that it had caused a significant argument. I told her I believed her. She said she was sorry. I told her that her apology was accepted and meant something to me and that I wanted to say something in return that I hoped she would hear in the spirit it was intended. I told her that the wedding had been beautiful and that I had been glad to contribute to it and that I would make the same financial decision again because her happiness mattered to me. I also told her that the experience had clarified some things for me about what I needed from my relationships in the years I had remaining, and that I had made some decisions based on that clarity that she would eventually become aware of. She asked me what decisions. I told her they were reflected in my estate documents and that Howard Park held copies and that she was welcome to have a conversation with me about them whenever she was ready, but that the decisions were made and were not a negotiation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she understood. I told her I loved her. She said she loved me. We talked for another 20 minutes about her work and Marcus's new project and the apartment they were looking at in a different neighborhood, and it was the most normal conversation we had had in over a year. I told Quame about the wedding seating chart on one of our Sunday calls about 3 months after the event. I had not told him before because I had been processing it, and because Quame had a protective instinct toward me that sometimes expressed itself as anger on my behalf, and I had wanted to be past the anger myself before I invited his. When I told him, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said I was better than okay. I said I had made some decisions that I felt good about and that the situation had clarified some things for me that I thought needed clarifying. He said, "That sounds like you." I said I hoped so. He said, "You know, Mom would have handled this at the venue. She would have found Patricia Reinhold and had a 10-minute conversation, and Patricia Reinhold would have spent the rest of the evening pretending it had been her idea to move you to the head table." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed about any of it. I said, "Your mother would have had her at table 1 before the first course." Quame said, "Table 1. Next to the Reinholds." We laughed together for a moment across the distance between Maryland and Houston, and I sat on my balcony in the evening light with the phone at my ear, and felt Gloria in the conversation the way she is sometimes present in the conversations between the people who loved her, not as a ghost, but as a quality of understanding that she left behind in the people she raised. I want to address Patricia Reinhold directly, not to her. She will not read this, but in the interest of completing the picture honestly. Patricia Reinhold is not a malicious person. She is a person who organizes the world according to a set of assumptions about who belongs at the center of things and who belongs at the edges, and who has never been seriously challenged on those assumptions because the social world she operates in largely shares them. Putting Ada's father at table 11 was not, I think, an act of deliberate cruelty. It was an act of casual precedence, the assumption that the father of the bride was a peripheral figure in a wedding that the Reinhold family was hosting in the sense that mattered to them, which is to say hosting in the social and organizational sense regardless of who was writing the checks. I was the money, Gerald was the host. That is a distinction that people in Patricia Reinhold's world make with the ease of long practice and without feeling the need to examine it. What I want to say about that is simply this. The money and the host are not always different people. And when you treat the person writing the checks as a guest at the event those checks made possible, you are making a statement about value that the person writing the checks will hear clearly even if you intend it as a mere matter of logistics. I heard it clearly, I responded accordingly. The response is in the documents Howard Park holds in his files on behalf of his client. That is the only response that needed to be made. I have been in the condominium for 11 months. The evenings on the balcony have become the part of the day I organize other things around. I drink tea in the summer and coffee in the fall, and I watch the light change over the buildings to the west, and I think about Gloria with the specific quality of missing that has replaced the acute grief of the first years, and that is, while still heavy, also something I have learned to find comfort in because it is evidence of something real that existed. I have started writing, not publicly just for myself, notes and observations and memories and the kind of thinking that benefits from being put in sentences. Gloria kept journals her entire adult life and left 22 of them in a box in the study that I have not yet opened, because I am not yet ready, and that I may not open in my lifetime, because some things a person writes are written for themselves, and not for the people who loved them, and I want to respect the possibility that those journals are that kind of writing. I have been invited to speak on a panel at an infrastructure conference in the spring, a topic I know well and that I find I still have things to say about. I said yes, I am not finished, I am not diminished. I am a 64-year-old man with a balcony and a view and a set of estate documents that accurately reflect his life and his values and his understanding of what he built and who helped him build it. That is enough. That is more than enough. My name is Walter Okafor. I am 64 years old. I came to this country at 19 with an academic scholarship and a set of values that my parents had placed in me as carefully as engineers place load-bearing elements in a structure, not decoratively but functionally, because they understood that what a person is made of determines what they can carry. I spent 32 years in a career that required me to build things correctly the first time because the things I was building carried people's daily lives. I raised 2 children with a woman who was exceptional in ways that I am still discovering years after her death. I wrote $58,000 in checks to make my daughter's wedding exist. I sat at table 11. I drove home in silence. And I made decisions that reflected what I actually knew about my life and my relationships and my values rather than what I had wished were true or what was convenient to believe. Nobody put me at table 11 to humiliate me. They put me at table 11 because they had not been paying attention. Because the man who writes the check is easy to overlook when you have already decided what kind of man he is before you have taken the trouble to find out. I am that kind of man. The kind who sits at table 11 and smiles at the strangers around him and eats the food he paid for and dances once with his daughter and drives home and makes 3 decisions in 40 minutes of silence that take 14 months to fully execute. I am the kind of man who finishes what he starts. I always have been. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. There are more of us out here than any of us knew, and every single voice in this community matters. Subscribe if you have not already. There is more to come.